Welcome. This is a video about what it means to be human in the age of AI. I'm going to try and argue that being human is about much more than the sassy characteristics, sentience, agency, consciousness, intelligence. And I'm also going to try and argue that the question, how close is AI to being human, is actually really small, really conservative, really uninteresting actually as a question. It's like asking how horse-like is a dog or how close to an automobile is a carriage. Well, if we only understand cars as horseless carriages, then we're never really going to understand cars at all. And similarly, if we only ever understand AI as something like a human that's not really a human, then we're never going to understand AI at all. I'm also going to try and argue that there is something unique about being human, but it's not all of those traits that usually get wheeled out in debates about humanity and AI. It's not our emotions, it's not our pain, it's not our humour, it's not our empathy, it's not having a body, it's not anything like that. I want to begin, however, with a question. What would you have to lose to stop being you? So, for example, if you lost your dashing good looks tomorrow, would you cease to be yourself? I think most of us would say, no, of course not. Beauty fades, but me as a person, I remain. What if you lost then your wit, that quick spark that makes people laugh at your jokes or just want to hang around you? If you lose that, are you still you? Or let's push it further. What if you lost your intellect? You might think of yourself as a careful reasoner or a problem solver, the one who can hold 5 ideas in his or her head at the same time and braid them into one. If you lose that, is it still you? Or let's make it even harder. What if you lost your memories? The summers you spent when you were a kid, the school you went to, the birth of your first child if you're a parent, the failures that you learned from, the faces etched on your memory, the smell of your first apartment. If you lost all of those, would you still be you? Let's go even further. Imagine you lost your language, can't speak anymore, can't understand language anymore. Imagine if you lost the use of your body, your capacity to feel emotion. Imagine if you lost your capacity to communicate, your sight, your hearing, your taste, your smell, your touch, your brain function. And if you kept losing these things one after another, where is the point at which you cross the line? Where is the point at which it's not that you just don't feel yourself anymore, but you actually cease to be yourself? And a related question, is there a point along that line at which you would cease to be human? Now, consciously or not, you and I carry around with us a working definition of what it means to be us and what it means to be human. And all of us, we apply that definition when a friend gets ill, or when a parent drifts into dementia, or when a child surprises us with a talent that we never knew they had. And since November 22, with the launch of ChatGPT, we also apply these intuitions when we open a chat window and a machine seems to talk to us as if we were its friend. Now, back in 2016, I wrote a book about what it means to be a human being, New Figures of the Human in Badiou, Meillassoux, Malabou, Serre, and Latour, 5 French philosophers. And in this video, I want to revisit some of the arguments from that book in the light of current debates in AI. And I want to explore how AI is revealing our assumptions to us, and our blind spots actually, about what a human being is, about who we are. I want to begin with a fragment from Pascal's Pensées. It's one of the fragments that has most haunted me over the years, ever since I studied it as an undergraduate back in the late 1990s. In this passage, Pascal is reflecting on what we really love when we say that we love someone. And this passage gives us, I think, a profound and a perplexing opening into the question of what a human being is. Let me read it in French. You get the cadence and the rhythm of the original, and then I'll read it in English. For those of you who enjoy digging into Pascal, it's 688 in the Lafuma numbering and 323 in Brunswick. Pascal writes, Qu'est-ce que le moi? Un homme qui se met à la fenêtre pour voir des passants. Si je passe par là, puis-je dire qu'il s'est mis là pour me voir? Ah non, car il ne pense pas à moi en particulier. Mais celui qui aime quelqu'un à cause de sa beauté, l'aime-t-il? Ah non, car la petite vérole qui tuera la beauté sans tuer la personne fera qu'il ne l'aimera plus. Et si on m'aime pour mon jugement, pour ma mémoire, m'aime-t-on, moi? Non, car je puis perdre ces qualités sans me perdre moi-même. Où est donc ce moi, s'il n'est ni dans le corps, ni dans l'âme? Et comment aimer le corps ou l'âme, sinon pour ces qualités, qui ne sont point ce qui fait le moi, puisqu'elles sont périssables? Car aimerait-on la substance de l'âme d'une personne abstraitement et quelques qualités qui y fussent? Cela ne se peut. Ce serait injuste. On n'aime donc jamais personne, mais seulement des qualités. Qu'on ne se moque donc plus de ceux qui se font honorer pour des charges et des offices, car on n'aime personne que pour des qualités empruntées. What is the self? A man who sits at a window to watch passers-by. Can I say that he sat there to see me if I pass by? No, for he's not thinking of me in particular. But someone who loves a person because of her beauty. Does he love her? No, because smallpox, which will destroy beauty without destroying the person, will ensure that he no longer loves her. And if someone loves me for my judgment, for my memory, is it me they love? No, because I can lose those qualities without losing myself. Where is the self, then, if it's neither in the body nor in the soul? And how can you love the body or the soul except for its qualities, which do not make up the self, since they're perishable? For would we love the substance of a person's soul in the abstract, whatever qualities it contained? That's impossible, and it would be unjust. Therefore, we never love a person, only qualities. So let us stop mocking people who are honoured for their appointments and offices. For we love no one except for his borrowed qualities. Hardly a month has gone by since I studied that passage in the late 90s without it returning to my thoughts in one way or another. I think it's a troubling thought. And the more we linger on it, I think the more troubling it gets. Let me assume something of you. It's certainly true of me. We all want to be loved for ourselves, don't we? And Pascal says, what do you mean for yourself? Which self? All the things that are typically you, all your characteristic traits, all those things about you that make people say, oh, that's so typically him, that's so unmistakably her, all of those things. They can be swept away. And yet, adds Pascal, and this is right, isn't it, surely? You remain, don't you? You are not your beauty, you are not your wit, exhaustively. But then, of course, that raises the question, what is this you, this me, that remains after all these qualities have gone or have changed. So, has anyone, rather grim thought here, has anyone ever really loved you? Does anyone really love you now? And if your answer is yes, of course, then what do you think they're loving? You? Some sort of abstract essence? How is that possible? How is that even just? Pascal says. Or are they loving your passing qualities? You see, Pascal is putting us here in a double bind. You and I, and thank goodness, we're not our looks or our wit or even our memories. We can lose those things without ceasing to be you or me. But if you take all those borrowed qualities away, then what have you got left? Some sort of abstract, pure idea of humanity without any senses, without any personality, without any memory, without any beauty. There's something so theoretical and removed from any real individual that it really ceases to be you at all, doesn't it? That's not you. You can't love that. So then, let me ask one last time, those people who love you, can you really say that they love you? What do you even mean when you make that claim? And then Pascal, towards the end of this passage, turns his blade outward, doesn't he? So stop mocking those, he says, who are honoured for their offices. He's really trying to dig the knife in at this point. Don't look down on the person who sucks up to the boss just because they're the boss. Nobody likes that person, do they? Don't look down on the person who fawns on the rich just because they're rich. Because your good looks, your wit, your memories, your intellect, they're just like that person's riches. They're borrowed. They're passing qualities. The robe of the judge, the bling of the rich person, the beauty of a face, the eloquence of a mind, the charm of a personality, it's all the same thing. All loves boil down to loving someone because of their bank account. And that's Pascal's argument. Just sit with the honesty of that for a moment. Recall perhaps your first infatuation. What did you fall in love with? Was it the person? Was it the light that they threw on the room every time they entered? Recall the colleague at work that everyone admires. Is it her, or is it her competence? Is it the calm she projects? You see, Pascal, I think, in this passage is not trying to be cynical. He's trying to be diagnostic. He's telling us how attention works. He's telling us how admiration forms and how love can be tricked by its own surface. And if Pascal is right, that we attach only ever to borrowed qualities, and then the temptation is obvious, isn't it? Think of AI. You have fluency, speed, civility, accuracy, style. Well, these are all admirable qualities. And modern AI, contemporary large language models, become the apotheosis of Pascal's warning. It's a machine built entirely out of borrowed qualities. These qualities being mined from our language, scraped from our images, distilled into weights. LLMs are perfectly lovable in Pascal's sense, and also at the same time perfectly nobody. So what's the difference then between loving a person for their borrowed qualities and loving an LLM for its borrowed qualities? Before we try and solve that problem, and by the end of this video I will have suggested a solution to it, let's step back a century and shift our perspective from the question, what do I love, to who am I? This question is famously asked in the 16th century by the French essayist Michel de Montaigne in an essay called On Excitement. Let me first read it in French again, and then in the English. Je ne peins pas l'être. Je peins le passage. Non un passage d'âge en autre, ou, comme dit le peuple de 7 en 7 ans, mais de jour en jour, de minute en minute. Il faut accommoder mon histoire à l'heure. Je puis tantôt changer non de fortune seulement, mais aussi d'intention. C'est un contre-rôle de divers immuables accidents et d'imaginations irrésolues, et, quand il y échec, contraire. Soit que je sois autre moi-même, soit que je saisisse les sujets par autres circonstances et considérations. Tant y a que je me contredis bien l'aventure, mais la vérité, comme dit Desmadès, je ne la contredis point. Si mon âme pouvait prendre pied, je ne m'asserrais pas, je me résoudrais. Elle est toujours en apprentissage et en épreuve. Je propose une vie basse et sans lustre. C'est du temps. On attache aussi bien toute la philosophie morale à une vie populaire et privée qu'à une vie de plus riche étoffe. Chaque homme porte la forme entière de l'humaine condition. À ce propos, je me fais bien souvent une telle demande. Qui suis-je moi-même à ce point, sinon une énigme à moi-même? I do not paint being. I paint passing. Not a passage from one age to another, or as people say, from 7 years to 7 years, but from day to day, from minute to minute. My story must be fitted to the moment. I may change suddenly, not only by chance, but by intention as well. This book is a record of various and shifting accidents, of unsettled and, when it so happens, contradictory imaginings. Whether because I myself am different, or because I grasp the subjects from different circumstances and perspectives. It is true that I often contradict myself. But as Descartes said, I do not contradict the truth. If my soul could ever find firm footing, I would not be trying myself out, I would resolve myself. But it's always in apprenticeship, always in trial. I set forth a lowly and unadorned life. But it makes no difference. Moral philosophy attaches just as well to a humble private life as to one made of richer stuff. Every man bears the entire form of the human condition, and so I often ask myself this question: who am I at this moment, if not an enigma to myself? Now, what is Montaigne trying to do in this famous, this resonant passage? Well, he's refusing, isn't he, to chase a permanent sense of me. He's refusing to nail the me down in some sort of unchanging form. He won't pretend that there's some sort of crystalline essence of Michel-ness that he can bottle. Instead, what he's offering is essay attempts, little portraits of the self in motion. And, he contradicts himself, he admits it, he smiles at the fact. The point is not to produce a final definition, a final authoritative account of who Michel de Montaigne is, but to cultivate a certain way of looking, both at himself and the world, a patient, candid, curious way. And this is not the same thing as it is saying that the self is nothing. It's more like saying that the self is lived before it can ever be defined, and over and above what can ever be defined. And the dignity that Montaigne is trying to put his finger on here is not shown in a fixed list of traits, but in the very capacity to change, to revise oneself, to repent, to be moved by reasons or by love or by grief, not to be the same person tomorrow as I am today. That is dignity for Montaigne. To be human is to be an enigma to oneself. I wonder how you think that relates to AI. Let's not be too hasty. Let's not simply jump to the knee-jerk conclusion, AI can never be an enigma to itself, because I think there's a sense in which it can. Transformer models are black boxes because even though when every weight in their array is measurable, the pathways which they generate for a particular output is often inscrutable. When the current generation of reasoning models explain how they thought when they come to a response, it's not really uncovering a genuine process, or it's more offering a post hoc rationalization constructed in language just as it constructs any other answer. We don't know how large language models think at the most fundamental level, and perhaps most strikingly, neither do the models themselves at the level of individual pathways. Now, Montaigne admitted that he was an enigma to himself, but that human opacity is a lived opacity, isn't it? We feel the tug of motives we don't understand. We feel the subterranean pressures of desire and guilt and memory. And our ignorance of ourselves is not a defect necessarily, but a part of our condition as beings who live forward into an unknown future. But is that what's going on in an LLM's opacity? No, I don't think it is. I think the opacity inside an LLM is different. It's not mystery inhabited, if you like. It's complexity concealed. There's an entanglement of process that's too dense for us to follow, that can't be lived from within, that can't be apprehended because it is the very architecture of apprehension. So perhaps I think we need a new category to describe the opacity of LLMs to themselves. You've got objects like, a table or a mug of coffee like the one I've got in front of me. Let's call these things transparent. They are what they appear to be. Or at least we can say minimally, they are not aware of themselves as enigmatic. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got humans, like Montaigne is talking about, who are enigmatic. We have a self-opacity that's born of finitude, born of freedom, that it lived from the inside. It's always more than the sum of our traits. But LLMs are neither transparent like a table, nor enigmatic like a human. So we need a third category in the middle. Let's call it opaque. They're opaque not because they have an inner self that eludes them, but because their inner workings are an impenetrable black box of computation. Now, one of the reasons we are so quick often to anthropomorphize AI is that I think we've quietly adopted a very thin account of ourselves that dumbs down this Montaignean element of enigma. So if we begin by thinking that a human is a list of high-performing traits, a good persona plus a fluent style, well then, yeah, a model can imitate you alarmingly well. But if you think a human life is a mystery, lived from the inside, like Montaigne, if we think that it's messy, it's contradictory, it's capable of repentance, regret and promise, then it's hard to see where current large language models can even begin to live in that way. They have no inside from which to be ashamed, or to be imputable, or to be forgiven. So set Montaigne next to Pascal, and what we've got so far is a very charged contrast. Pascal is running a subtraction test, isn't he? Flicking away these borrowed qualities one by one and finding that love attaches only to these qualities that pass. Montaigne is doing something different. He's running a patience test. And he's finding that the self is precisely what passes, what changes, what can't be pinned down. If Pascal is making us feel the loss and be frightened for its consequences, Montaigne is asking us to befriend the flux, to find ourselves in the change, in the mutation. I think it is a very rich and a very powerful contrast, especially when it comes to thinking about AI. And I think we need both of these. We need both Montaigne and Pascal. Because without Pascal, we end up risking flattering ourselves just with surfaces. We are our qualities. But without Montaigne, we risk torturing ourselves with impossible ideals of self-consistency and actually inhuman ideals of self-consistency as well. But when we love someone, even for their borrowed qualities, I think, and see if you agree with me, that our love does actually rest on an assumption that somewhere in the whole complex ball of wool that is our love, there is more to this person we're loving than their qualities. Or at least that some of their qualities cohere into something that's different from just the amalgamated sum of each of these individual qualities. See, if I love someone only for their beauty, to use Pascal's own example, is it only the quality of beauty that I love? See, I'm not sure it is. It's this beauty, it's this particular beautiful one, isn't it? It's not beauty in the abstract. The beauty draws me into a communion as a human being, or at least it should. And it's a communion that the beauty itself doesn't exhaust. And if the beauty does exhaust everything, well then perhaps I was never in love to begin with. Perhaps it was only lust all along. So in order to develop Pascal's thinking more, perhaps we can say that as human beings, yes, sometimes we come for the beauty, but we stay for something more. Something that's not a borrowed quality. And the question then raised in relation to AI is whether there's an equivalent something more for a large language model, something more than the borrowed qualities of its efficiency and its fluency and its helpfulness and its civility and so forth. And to help us press into this question, I want to turn now to a key distinction introduced into philosophy by Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes in the 17th century. It's a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are usually understood to be the things that are necessary for a being to be itself. Take them away, you've lost the thing. Secondary qualities are features that the thing may or may not have, but they're not necessary for making it what it is. So, for example, think of a rubber ball. Its primary qualities are things like its roundness and its solidity. If you take those things away, if it stops being round or solid, then, well, you no longer have a ball at all. Its secondary qualities are things like its colour or the squeak it makes when you squeeze it. A rubber ball could be red or it could be blue, it could be squeaky or it could be silent, but it would still be a ball. The colour and the sound and the shape of our experience of it aren't necessary for it to be what it is. They're secondary qualities. Now, the roots of this distinction between primary and secondary qualities trace well back before the modern era. So ancient Greek philosophers like Democritus and Plato reflected on the difference between the qualities that are intrinsic to matter and those that are merely perceived. But they didn't formalise the terminology as we use it today. During the scholastic period, medieval philosophers did explicitly distinguish between different types of qualities, often framing the difference between fundamental causal qualities and those that are dependent on observers. But it's really in the modern age that this distinction between primary and secondary qualities becomes clear and operationalised. And one of the first key thinkers to employ it is René Descartes. Now, Descartes, of course, is a philosopher who is determined not to be fooled. And so in Meditations 2, he puts a piece of beeswax by the fire and watches it change, watches it melt. The smell evaporates, the colour of the beeswax dulls, the hardness softens, the shape collapses. And Descartes reflects, look, if the wax were defined by its scent or its colour or its hardness of it or its shape, then, well, it'd have ceased to become wax, wouldn't it, when it melted? And yet, says Descartes, we know it's still the same wax. So let's not be fooled by colour and hardness and scent and shape. Let's try and apprehend how we know that this is still the same wax. Well, it's certainly not by imagination, Descartes says. We can't picture all the possible forms the molten wax might take. The reason we know it's the same wax, he says, is by the mind alone. What the mind perceives are the properties that belong to a body as such. Modes of extension such as size and shape and position and motion and rest and divisibility. These are the things that make up the wax in itself. Everything else, the sweet, the scent, the warm glow, the pleasing shape, well, they only exist in the perceiving subject. They're secondary. I think it's important to realise that Descartes isn't trying to banish the senses from the way that we know things. He's just trying to put them, as he sees it, in their proper place. Senses for Descartes, they're good servants, but they're really bad masters, because if you want to really know what belongs to a thing, you've got to strip away all the trappings that vary from moment to moment, the sense, the touch, the shape, the taste. You've got to grasp what remains constant through change for Descartes. But notice again here the risk for our theme of thinking about AI. Because if you apply the wax test to the self, you're tempted to say, look, just ignore the passing expressions, ignore all our moods, ignore our laughter, ignore our voice. Look for the modes of extension that remain constant through all the changes of a human life. And for Descartes, that comes down to one thing. It comes down to thinking. His famous cogito ergo sum, I am thinking, therefore I exist. So I can doubt every property that I have, according to Descartes, but I can't doubt that I am a thing that thinks. Because if I doubt it, I'm thinking. And if I'm thinking, then I am a thing that thinks. The thing about the cogito, then, is that it exalts the mind as the key quality of a human being. And it demotes everything else. And over the centuries, this has become, I think, our cultural reflex. We've been taught to treat the mind as the person, with the body as mere scaffolding, emotions as mere noise. And we end up with a theory of the self that reduces us to our thinking, and that struggles, therefore, to differentiate between a thinking human being and a thinking machine. Now, a similar distinction between primary and secondary qualities was made by someone who in many ways was Descartes' great rival, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes never used the language of primary and secondary qualities, but he does make a distinction that is very close to this difference. So, for example, writing in Leviathan, he puts with his characteristic Hobbesian bluntness, the universe, that is the whole mass of things that are, is corporeal. And that which is not body is no part of the universe. In other words, if you can't weigh it or measure it or push it, it's not real for Hobbes. But what of all those sense impressions, colour, sound, warmth, taste? Well, for Hobbes, those things are called phantasms, chimeras. Sensible qualities, he says, are not little colours glued to objects or little tiny sounds hidden inside the bell. They are the effect on us of motions outside of us, pressure on the eye, as he has it in his theory of vision, vibration in the air or agitation of the nerves. So the world, what exists, is purely bodies in motion. And all the rest of it, sound, taste, touch, smell, is how bodies in motion feel to a particular creature like us. And Hobbes' insistence that primary qualities are mechanical, they're to do with bodies and motion, also extends to his account of human beings. Just listen how he opens the introduction to Leviathan. Let me quote the whole first page of his introduction, because it is a crucial passage for the whole scaffolding of the way we think about artificial intelligence today, I think. Hobbes writes, nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so also in this, imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within, why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring? And the nerves but so many strings? And the joints but so many wheels giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer? Art goes yet further, imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, man. For by art is created that great Leviathan called commonwealth, or state in Latin, civitas, which is but an artificial man, though of greater stature and strength than the natural, for whose protection and defence it was intended, and in which the sovereignty is an artificial soul, as giving life and motion to the whole body. The magistrates and other officers of judicature and execution artificial joints. Reward and punishment, by which fastened to the seat of the sovereignty every joint and member is moved to perform his duty, are the nerves, that do the same thing in the body natural. The wealth and riches of all the particular members are the strength. Salus populi, the people's safety, its business. Counsellors, by whom all things needful for it to know are suggested unto it, are the memory. Equity and laws, an artificial reason and will. Concord, health. Sedition, sickness. And civil war, death. Lastly, the pacts and covenants by which the parts of this body politic were at first made, set together and united, resembled that fiat, or the let us make man, pronounced by God in the creation. Do you know what? We could reflect on this passage for hours. It is richly fascinating as a window into the way that we think about AI. But for now, let's just make 3 observations. Number 1, for Hobbes, the primary qualities of a human being are mechanical. You and I, dear viewer, are fundamentally springs and strings and wheels for Hobbes. All the rest is details. Number 2, the idea of making an artificial man is nothing new. In fact, for Hobbes, human beings as such are and have always been artificial. I wonder if you caught that in the first sentence. It's a huge assumption that Hobbes is bringing in right at the beginning of Leviathan. Let me read it again. Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in so many other things, so also in this, imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. So what's he claiming here? What is nature for Hobbes? What is natural? Well, nature is God's artifice. So there's nothing strange then about an artificial man, one made of strings and pulleys and wheels. All people are artificial. They're made by that divine artifice that we call nature. 3rd observation. Notice how Hobbes slips effortlessly from the natural man to the political man. The leap from springs and strings in the body to laws and magistrates in the commonwealth. It's not a detour for Hobbes. It's actually the heart of his argument, because for Hobbes, what makes a person tick and what makes a state tick, if you like, are the same thing. Mechanics, motion, arrangement. The body for Hobbes is an engine, and the body politic is a bigger engine made of lots of smaller ones. And that move, I think, matters for the age of AI, because once you see human beings as essentially mechanical, like Hobbes does, then it's not inconceivable, is it, to build an artificial man? It becomes inevitable, in fact, that we're going to have a go and try. And once you see society itself as an artificial man, then the leap to imagining an artificial intelligence as a kind of political actor, something that issues commands and governs and channels power, it's a very short leap indeed, isn't it? So Hobbes then isn't just laying the groundwork for mechanism as a philosophy of mind, the idea that our minds are just very small bodies in motion. He's also laying the groundwork, I think, for our whole culture of the imaginary of artificial intelligence, how we conceive of, how we intuit artificial intelligence. The idea that you can take motion and arrangement and calculation and scale them up and get something that acts like a self or acts like a state. Why does all this matter for our question of AI? Because when you ask what is a self in a Hobbesian world, which is in many important aspects our modern world, then you're tempted to equate the person with what can be computed. The length, the speed, the firing rate, the input-output profile, which translates very nicely indeed across from humanity to LLMs. So we've had a look at primary and secondary qualities in Descartes and in Hobbes. Our third and final major thinker on the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and indeed the philosopher who is often most associated with those terms, is John Locke. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke defines primary qualities as those that are inseparable from our bodies, things like solidity, extension, figure, motion, rest, and number. And he famously illustrates these with the idea of a grain of wheat. Let me read his passage. He says, "Take a grain of wheat, divide it into two parts. Each part has still solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. Divide it again. It retains all the same qualities. And so divide it on till the parts become insensible. In other words, so small you can't see them. They must retain still, each of them, all those qualities. For division, which is all that a carpenter or a chemist can do, either in cutting or pounding, dissolving or melting, never takes away either solidity, extension, figure or mobility from any body, but only makes two or more distinct separate masses of matter, of that which was but one before, or which distinct masses, reckoned as so many distinct bodies after division, make a certain number." So, however finely you divide matter up, it always retains solidity, extension, figure and mobility. These are its primary qualities. Secondary qualities, by contrast for Locke, are nothing in the objects themselves, but they're the powers that these objects have to produce sensations in us. So here's Locke again on secondary qualities this time. For instance, he says, the idea of heat or light, which we receive by our eyes, ears and touch, are commonly looked on as real qualities existing in the things themselves. But if we consider that the idea of whiteness or coldness is not in snow itself, but is only a power in snow to produce those ideas in us. So the idea of primary and secondary qualities are to do with whether those qualities are in the object itself for Locke. Primary qualities are, secondary qualities aren't. I want now to bring together Locke and Pascal, see if we can use Locke to solve Pascal's issue of borrowed qualities. Because according to Locke, we can identify a primary core of the person, can't we? It's the analogue of extension and figure. Surely we found the thing that remains when all Pascal's secondary borrowed qualities fall away, haven't we? Well, I'm afraid we haven't for Locke. Because when Locke talks about a person, he talks about them not in terms of their physical body, their primary qualities, but in terms of consciousness and memory. And in fact, Locke famously argues that personal identity follows consciousness rather than substance, rather than my physical makeup. Locke argues that if your consciousness were transferred, you would be the same person. You would follow your consciousness. You wouldn't follow your body. He gives this famous illustration. For should the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enter and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees that he would be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions. But who would say that it was the same man? The body, too, goes into the making of a man and would, I guess, to everybody determine the man in this case, wherein the soul, with all those powers of thinking it had before, should go along with the prince, leave one body and take another. Everyone would see it was the same person with the prince, though the body of the cobbler, which it was annexed to, made it a different man. Locke's point is fascinating, isn't it? And I think it's this. Personal identity, the same person, is not about the body, or about the soul as some sort of substance. It's about a continuity of consciousness and memory. You might be the same man, to use his language, according to your physical body, but you're not the same person. Your personhood follows your consciousness, not your body. And here, I think, is where Locke's thought experiment finds its contemporary resonance in relation to AI, because if Locke is right that personal identity follows consciousness and memory, then AI unsettles the edges of that claim, doesn't it? Because what's a large language model if not a system that has memory in its training data and a continuity carried across versions and instances? Now, of course, it's got no inner self-awareness. It's got no felt continuity. But from the outside, we do experience a kind of persistence, don't we, as if it were an ongoing consciousness. It's the same style, the same capabilities, the same conversation picked up weeks later as if no time had passed. Or think of David Chalmers' thought experiment of a human brain that's gradually replaced one neuron at a time with a silicon-based substitute. Now, if the consciousness is maintained across this process, is the consciousness of the silicon brain that you end up with the same person as the consciousness that was originally on the organic brain? That's Chalmers' question. And if you say, no, it's not, it can't be the same, then at what point does that consciousness change? Do you have slightly less consciousness, one neuron at a time? Or is there, as Chalmers puts it, some magic neuron that once that one is changed, you're no longer the same person? Now, Chalmers' position here is called functionalism, because it's the function being performed by the neuron or by the silicon circuit that's the important thing, not whether the substrate happens to be organic or silicon. Now, consciousness here, for Chalmers, is the pattern of signals. It's not what hardware those signals happen or don't happen to be running on at a particular instant. So Locke's idea that identity follows consciousness and memory sits uneasily with any sense that we want to have, that we can lock humanity into primary qualities, because memory and consciousness precisely are not primary qualities in Locke's physical sense. They're fragile, aren't they? They're flowing, they're vulnerable to the very losses that Pascal lists. So even Locke can't get us beyond the borrowed self to some sort of primary, unmoving, fixed self. And by the late 20th century, this neatness frays even more. We discover through physics that supposed primaries like mass and space and time are themselves frame-dependent. Think Einstein. Through phenomenology, we discover that the so-called secondaries like colour and warmth, they're not mere froth, but they're part of how the world becomes present to a living body. The line between primary and secondary qualities is blurred on both sides. All of which returns us to our central question, which I think is becoming now our central ache. If you can't locate the self among the primary qualities, and if the secondary qualities are always borrowed and perishable, then what on earth is the self? Before I answer, I want to take one further step, it's the last one I promise, down the rabbit hole of primary and secondary qualities. And it's to raise this question, this rather 20th century question. What if human beings actually don't have any primary qualities at all? What if we're just a bundle of features that come and go with no centre, no foundation at all to anchor us? Well, that's the reality explored in the unfinished novel, the fascinating, provocative, early 20th century German novel by Robert Musil, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, the man without qualities. What Musil is doing is he's sort of taking Pascal's fear and Montaigne's flux, and he's mixing them in with the incapacity of primary qualities to account for humanity and individuality. And he's showing us, really presciently, I think, what happens when a culture loses its grip on the notion of a fixed, stable humanity. And in this way, his novel is really prophetic about how many people experience selfhood in the 21st century. Musil's protagonist is called Ulrich. He's educated, he's perceptive, he's ironic, he's often very charming. He has talents, he has insights, he has appetites, but he has no binding, no core, no foundation in relation to which all these secondary qualities are orientated. He's got intelligence, but it doesn't add up to conviction. He's got appetites, but they don't add up to anything like a vocation. As Musil writes, hatte Eigenschaften, aber sie waren nicht durch eine feste Vorstellung vom Ich zusammengehalten. Man konnte fast sagen, war ein Mann ohne Eigenschaften. He had qualities, but they were not bound together by a firm idea of the self. One could almost say that he was a man without qualities. And so as over the course of this really fascinating novel, Musil sketches this character Ulrich, he's also sketching a society in which people have become mere arrays or concatenations of traits, a mere list of skills on a CV or tastes on a playlist, opinions on a timeline, without any centre holding it all together. The self becomes a stage for borrowed styles, borrowed turns of phrase, borrowed appetites. The world asks you to be agile, to be a shapeshifter, and you oblige. That's who Ulrich is. And this, of course, is very close to where any number of commentators have said we are in our contemporary cultural moment today. Our institutions reward qualities like productivity, charisma, personal brand. Our platforms amplify qualities like outrage and wit and the performance of care. And we learn to curate ourselves in light of these prompts as a series of highlight reels. And after a while, we begin to feel exactly like Ulrich. Expansive and capable, absolutely, but somehow missing, not present on the stage of our own lives. Sociologists and philosophers from Emil Durkheim to Zygmunt Bauman and Charles Taylor have traced what Durkheim calls a sense of anomie, a dislocation at the heart of modern life. Bauman has that famous book, doesn't he, called Liquid Modernity, and this image of liquidity is trying to capture a world in which identity feels always fluid, provisional, stitched together from shifting roles and consumer choices, rather than sort of anchored in anything that can resist the pull of the market and anything durable. Taylor talks about the malaise of modernity. And I think what he's trying to get at there is the sense of a fragmented self that's struggling to cohere in the face of late modern pluralism, that's pulled in all different directions to the point where there's no centre left from which it is being pulled. Ulrich's predicament, then, in other words, has become our predicament. Many of us recognise the feeling, I think, that we are a bundle of qualities. We're job skills, we're aesthetic tastes, we're social media performances, without any unifying self pulling all the strings behind them. And we've learned, haven't we, very well, I think, to respond to the market. Reminds me of a quotation often attributed to Groucho Marx. Gentlemen, I have my principles. Here they are. And if you don't like them, I have others. It's how we behave in the market of identity today, isn't it? Which is why I think Musil speaks so very directly to the age of AI. Because AI is, in a very precise sense, the triumph of nothing but qualities. A large language model is all surface and no centre. It's the iteration of eloquence and civility and style without any biography behind it. We find its outputs compelling often because they echo our own voices. But what we're encountering is a play of attributes without a fixed agent behind them. And notice something really important here, unless it sounds as though I'm simply dumping on AI. Because at the very moment that AI appears more human, because it smoothly reproduces our qualities, at that same moment, we humans appear more AI-like in the way that our lives are fractured and mediated and performed through detachable, recombinable attributes. So the boundary between humanity and AI, I'm trying to suggest here, isn't static. Both human and machine are moving in response to each other. Humanity and AI are developing together. They're unsettling each other. And together they're redrawing the map of what it counts as a self. One way of putting it was, as AI is becoming increasingly human-like, humans are becoming increasingly like AI. Now, Musil doesn't solve this. He leaves it on the page for us to fret over. And I think that is incredibly useful rather than being incredibly frustrating. Because the temptation in our cultural moments, I think, is to reassure ourselves, isn't it? With easy lines. You hear them all over. AI will never be able to X. Humans are essentially Y. And they're often very confidently pronounced, aren't they? Yes, AI can do a lot, but it will never have emotion. It will never have empathy. It will never have a body. Humans will always have this or that thing that AI will never have. I think the question that we have to face is, how on earth could we possibly know? How we know what AI will be like 100, 200, 300 years into the future? It would be hubristic indeed to use that absolute word, never, in relation to this technology. And therefore, I think Musil asks a better question, although also a more painful question. He asks, what if we've already become the sort of people who can be plausibly mirrored by a thing without a self, by a large language model? To the extent that that is true, what does that say about us? Now, as we move to the next section, I'd like to get more systematic. I want to ask two questions and then bring them together. I want to ask, what are the qualities of human beings? And then I want to ask, what are the qualities of AI? And I want to see how those two sets of qualities compare to each other. So let's begin with humans. Because before we talk about AI, and I think this is often a mistake that's made in debates around AI, we need to sit patiently with the way that human existence shows up when you look at it through the lens of primary and secondary qualities. You know, what is necessary for us, you and me, to be ourselves? And what are the more fragile and borrowed and perishable features that colour our experience but are not necessary for us to be ourselves? I want to slow down and I want to take this across 7 different dimensions. And the reason I want to labour this is that I think a lot of these dimensions are very often ignored in the discussion of differences between humans and AI. But it's only by looking at all of them together and by considering their compound accumulation that we glimpse the complexity of the texture of human life, of what it means to be a human being. Let's start at the physical level. What is a human being? Well, a human being is a single situated body. It's a body made up of physical elements, molecules, hormones, nerves, synapses, all that stuff. But unlike AI, which is distributed across servers and cables, you and I are located, aren't we? We're within one particular body. We're fragile. We're bounded by our skin. You know, I am here and not where you are. You are there and not somewhere else. We're limited in where we can be. It takes time for our bodies to travel from one place to another. We can't be in 2 places at once. But even here, the secondary qualities are inseparable from our physical body itself, aren't they? You know, try and tell someone in pain to separate pain, or separate taste, or even pleasure, or warmth from their sense of what it is to be human in the world. Good luck trying to do that. These aren't detachable add-ons, are they? They're the colourings that make life livable, that make human life what it is. Take them away, you don't have human life as we understand it anymore. They're not secondary in that sense. And also, unlike AI, our physical story includes a biography, doesn't it? Because our bodies are born and they age, all too painfully in my case, and they decay. To be human is not just to exist, but it's to do so on a predictable, universal, temporal arc. And even in the mode of generation, how we make more humans, it's different to AI, isn't it? As humans, we beget. We don't make, where begetting means engendering another who is just like you. And this difference between being begotten and being made, it's haunted philosophy and theology for centuries. And I think it ought to haunt the difference between humanity and AI more than it does, at least for the time being, until AI can beget more AI, perhaps, in the future. So after the physical, secondly, we are cultural beings. We're makers, aren't we? We make tools, we make languages, we make technologies. And our language is a technology just as much as our tools are. But we're not just possessors of language in the abstract. We are speakers of particular tongues, each with their own inflections and differences. One of the reasons I love reading quotations out in the original languages. There's something unique and irreplaceable about each particular language and each particular dialect of that language. Their particular accents and idioms and histories. They're not incidental to meaning, as if there's some secondary quality that can be threshed away from the husk of pure meaning. It's a very naive view of language, that. We each individually, don't we, have our particular jargon. We have the words of our niches and our subcultures and our local accents and our dialects. And so, in other words, language situates me and it situates you within a particular cultural tradition. And it also individuates me. In other words, human language both divides me from others and it joins me to others. And we're also, all of us, bearers of memory, aren't we? Both personal memory and common memory, some of which is passed on to us in traditions and habits and rituals. You know, we've got our grandmother's recipes, we've got the music that first made us fall in love, we've got the Shakespeare that we learned at school, all of these memories, both individual and shared. Now, they're not primary in Locke's sense. You know, we can get rid of our memories and we still breathe as organisms. But they are constitutive, are they not, of who you and I are as individuals. They situate us, they make us from here and not from there, from somewhere else. They make it that we grew up in this decade and not in that. They make the self storied, not just stored, if you like. And how do human beings inhabit time? Well, human time is linear, isn't it? You're born, you live, you die. You don't do that backwards. It's irreversible, it's finite. You and I age. And despite our best efforts and what some people on the internet may be promising us, we cannot reset. We can't stop aging completely. We know this, don't we, in our bones, our creaking bones, and we know it in our calendars as well. The early 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger very resonantly called this being toward death. It's the fact that every day is lived against the horizon of our finitude. I am a person who is going to die, and that is how I exist day by day, shapes my experience of the world. Again, this is not a secondary garnish. It is primary to human existence. Because a life is not simply a sequence of events, is it? It's a narrative arc with a shape to it. Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, reminds us that narrative is not just some sort of retrospective embroidery, trying to make sense of things looking back. It is the very medium in which we become who we are. It's how we relate ourselves to discover for the first time who we are. Narrative is fundamental to how we exist and how we understand ourselves as human beings. To live in time, humanly, is to live stories. But if we've got Heidegger's being towards death, the philosopher Hannah Arendt also reminds us that human temporality is also bounded by what she calls natality, the fact that every new birth enters into the world as a beginning, and as a beginning that's never existed before. It's a fresh capacity to act in ways that are unanticipated by the old order. So to be human then is not only to live toward an end, but also to live from a beginning. Our lives are bent around at both ends by mortality, also perhaps animated by the promise of renewal, the possibility of surprising each other and ourselves. And our lives are therefore profoundly story-shaped, aren't they? Your life and mine has a beginning, it has a middle, and it will have an end. And we don't just tell these stories about individual lives. Human beings are inveterate myth makers, aren't we? We tell stories about the world in which we live and the societies in which we exist. And it's through these common stories, these shared stories, that we make sense of ourselves. There are myths that orientate whole civilizations, creation stories, heroic epics, national myths of founding. And these myths are not just entertainment. They shape both our experience of time, but also our experience of our humanness, of our own identity. And even in a secular age, we live by these myths, don't we? Think of the myth, for example, of progress, or the myth of the free market, or the myth of endless growth, or the myth of the proletarian revolution. These stories are not primary qualities of bodies. You can't cut us open and see them inside. They're secondary in the Lockean sense. They depend on perceivers. They depend on people to keep telling these stories. But they are primary in terms of their cultural weight and their determining influence on what it means to be a human being in the world. They shape how we allocate trust, how we fear, how we hope, how we do all these very basically human things. And of course, any story is defined, isn't it, by the way it ends. If you haven't read the final chapter of a book, you don't really know what sort of book you're dealing with. Things can often be transformed radically in the final chapter. And therefore, death, quite unusually, quite peculiarly, is the temporal horizon that bends every moment of life from our birth onwards into a particular shape. And this means that humans inhabit time always with a sense of cost and sacrifice. Think about it. Because my life is finite, because I will die, every choice that I make is always a renunciation of other paths that I could have gone down. It's a sacrifice of everything else other than this one choice that I make. It's a whole universe of regrets with one moment that I'm choosing not to regret. And if, for example, I choose to spend my time with you as a human being, that costs me, doesn't it? I can't spend that time doing anything else, and I will never get that time back. The time that I'm spending making this video, the time that you're spending watching the video, and thank you very much, incidentally, is a time that you and I will never get back. This is costing us, isn't it? It's costing us to be doing this. There are real stakes in play here, even as you watch this video, even as I make it. The real meaning of my choices as a human being, given the context that my time is finite and I will die, are live. Every choice that I make has stakes, and those stakes are live and irreversible. Something very similar is the case in the way that we as human beings inhabit space. We're local, aren't we? We've got one body and it's got to be in one place and it can't be everywhere at once. To be a human is to be somewhere. My body situates me. More than that, I taste the bread of the country where I live. I breathe the air on my street. I adapt to the rhythms of the climates and often the conflicts of the soil on which I'm living. Place is not simply a background to a human life, isn't it? It's not an accident added on. My situatedness, where I happen to be and where I happen to have been, is a fundamental condition of who I am. As Heidegger again puts it, we don't float in some sort of neutral coordinates. We dwell, is Heidegger's word, in a world that's thick with nearness and distance and familiarity and strangeness. Space is no empty container for human beings. It is charged with horizon and again with cost. If I'm here, I cannot be also there. I have sacrificed in order to be here. And that, I think, is why space matters to humans. If I choose to be here doing this right now, rather than somewhere else doing something else, rather than living in a different country, I sacrifice very really, very immediately, the life that I could have lived somewhere else. Now, I can never live that life, and I will never be able to live it this day of my life. I live under laws that bind me spatially. Now, I carry passports and birth certificates that tether me to a particular soil. I am from this place, in my case, these places with dual citizenship, and not from that place. And this is not only, is it, the fact that I'm from somewhere, it's the fact that I'm from somewhere and therefore not from everywhere else. It's my limits that give my life meaning spatially. I give my life stakes spatially. My attachments to particular places are not simply external. They infuse my identity. all of it is inseparable ultimately from who I am as an individual, and more generally inseparable from what it means to me to be a human being. And in the next category, I want to gather together a lot of what I've been saying and try and focus it more clearly, because I want to argue that to be a human being and to be an individual is to be concerned. It might sound a strange way to put it. Let me explain what I mean. What I'm trying to get at here is Bruno Latour's idea that human beings do not primarily exist in a world of what he calls matters of fact, but in a world of matters of concern. So by matters of fact, Latour means, supposedly objective, finished facts like the ozone hole exists, for example, treated as a brute data beyond dispute. By contrast, matters of concern are facts that are always inextricably entangled with values, with uncertainties, with stakes. So, for instance, the hole in the ozone layer leads to global warming that makes life harder for vulnerable communities. That's a matter of concern. And we human beings have concerns and are animated mainly by concerns for the very good reason that we have needs, and we've got desires, and we've got lacks, and we've got wants. Those are the things that turn our facts into concerns. We have concerns because we've got a life to lose, and once we lose it, we can never get it back. So every choice that I make as a human being is a sacrifice. And this is very close to what Heidegger calls Sorge, care. The idea that our very being is structured not simply by objects that I relate to out there in the world, but by involvement and projection and concern. We're never indifferent observers of some sort of neutral world out there. We are always already invested in the world. We're bound up in what matters to us and in what matters to those that we love. And so the human mode of engagement with the world is one of concern, not fact. Most fundamentally, we seek satisfaction, we seek satiation. We do not navigate the world simply seeking information. And to exist in a world of concerns, not just of facts, is to be open to moods, to be vulnerable to others' words, to blush, to laugh, to weep, also to suffer humiliation, or loss, or despair, or pain. And again, in a Lockean frame, these are secondary qualities. They're how bodies in motion feel to us. But do they not carry primary weight in how we experience meaning and how we experience the world? A life without concern, I would suggest, is not a recognisably human life. But we humans are not just concerned individuals, are we? We're not just atoms of concern floating about in the universe. We're born into roles. We assume more roles as our lives progress. We are a child, we're a sibling, we're a citizen, we're workers, we're friends, we're rivals. And we exist within institutions, don't we? Primarily the institution of the family and then the community, within the institution of law and the state, within churches, within schools. These are not optional overlays to being human. They're structures through which human life becomes legible. And to be human is to be accountable and recognised within these roles. Unlike AI, which can be assigned a label by a company, it can be called an assistant, it can be called a co-pilot. Human institutions are not just designations, they carry imputability, the ability to be blamed, to carry responsibility, to be praised. If you're a human, you're not just called a teacher, are you? You can be prosecuted for failing to teach well for breaking the law as you teach. You can be praised for teaching well. You're answerable, imputable for how you teach. That is fundamental to human existence. Final category of what it means to be human. I've called it to be devoted. What I mean is that as humans, we're oriented to something beyond ourselves, very often something bigger than ourselves. We live our life by convictions, often ultimate commitments. In a theological register, we'd call them objects of worship. And for some of us, this is explicitly religious. We are oriented to God, to prayer, to worship. For others, it's secular, but it's no less ultimate. We're devoted to justice or to art or to truth, or perhaps to the idea of a nation or a family or some other vision of the good that guides us and stands outside and above us. This is the idea of homo adorans, the adoring or the worshipping human, the one who orients her or himself towards something ultimate. It's not about preferences. Worship is something that claims us, it summons us, it directs our life, it draws us out beyond ourselves. One of the clearest and profoundest thinkers on this, I think, in our tradition is Augustine. He, in his Confessions and again on the Trinity, holds out this worshipping dimension of all human life. In fact, he argues that it's a real human distinctive. And therefore, the fundamental human distinctive is not in any capacity or quality that we possess in ourselves. It's not ultimately in our intellect or our sentience or our consciousness or our agency. It's in what Augustine calls our capax Dei, our capacity for God. He's got that famous line, hasn't he, in his Confessions, "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Now, one thing that he's doing, among the many things that he's doing in this quotation, is he's not defining the self by a trait, but by an orientation. To be human is to be Godward, to be restless until we find our true beloved in whom we can rest. That is the shape, the tincture of human existence and experience for Augustine. And in his book on the Trinity, he explores the human as an image, but not the image of a list of features, but in relation to God. And this being in relation to God, for Augustine, shows up in the life of the mind, in memory and understanding and love. But it is not those things themselves that make us human. It is the Godwardness of them. Now, Augustine is not naive about losses. He knows that beauty fades, that memory falters, and that wit and will eventually fail. But he insists in the teeth of that reality, that the dignity of a person doesn't hang suspended from any of those hooks, such that when my identity falls, or my intelligence falls, or my will falls, my humanity falls with it. No, for Augustine, humanity is something deeper than that. It's a being known rather than a knowing. It's a being loved rather than a loving in the first instance. And this is, I think, what he means when he says that the human is capax Dei, capable of God, oriented toward God, capable of relation to the divine, not by virtue of any of its innate capacities, but by divine grace. And therefore, for Augustine, the I is not a substance hidden behind secondary qualities, nor is it a bundle of secondary qualities with nothing behind it. For Augustine, the ground of my humanity, and therefore also the ground of my dignity and my individuality, is being in relation, being loved, being known by God. And what anchors my identity is not the qualities that I've got that can be borrowed or lost, as Pascal so powerfully says, nor indeed is it in the flux in which Montaigne dwells and that he embraces. But it's in the fact of being summoned, being addressed, being held in covenant with ultimate reality, with God. And so while Musil shows us a person with nothing but qualities, and Augustine, on the other hand, insists that there is always more than qualities. But it's not some sort of uber quality. It's not some sort of primary quality that I have behind or underneath all my secondary qualities. It is the irreducible dignity, for Augustine, of the person in relation. It doesn't inhere in myself. My individuality, my personality, my humanity are always dialogic with God, the way that I am called to and loved by God. And I really do think that that gives us an incredibly precious and powerful resource as we consider AI. Because the moment that we collapse humanity into detachable traits, my beauty, my wit, my this, that, and the other, well, AI may match or outpace us in all of those things. It is foolish to say AI will never do this, will never do that. How do you know? How do I know? But if we remember that your and my individuality, and indeed your and my humanity, is constituted in relation. It's not a quality we possess. It is in being loved by, in Augustine's language, God, recognized by him, something in his eyes. Then we begin to see why no amount of borrowed qualities, no amount of dazzling can amount to a self in this particular way of looking at what a human being is. So then, across all these 7 dimensions of humanity, what do we see? Well, humans, you and I, are beings whose primaries, like solidity and mortality and embodiment, are, at the end of the day, inseparable from our secondaries, from taste, affect, memory, concern, story. We are both physical beings, absolutely, we've got bodies, but we are also narrative selves with concerns, and both our body's emotion and our sense of being beings who feel those motions, who have qualities to the way that we experience our bodies. Neither of those things can be thought of as primary to the exclusion of the other. So to take that example from Locke and Chalmers, we can't say that you simply transfer consciousness from one neuron to another, because the very fact of changing the substrate, changing the body, changes the experience of the world. So you may have a consciousness at the end of that process, but you don't have the same individual, even if the memories persist, because you can't abstract a person in the full-blooded sense of that term from their physicality, from their experience of time and space and so forth. But neither can you say that I am simply my body, with Hobbes, that I'm just strings and springs and wheels. And it's interesting, isn't it, that both of those ends, I am simply my consciousness and I am my body, end up in very similar places philosophically. And it's only the position that refuses to privilege one of those to the exclusion of the other that I think maintains the complexity of humanity that I've been trying to step through in these 7 categories in this section of the video. So you can strip us down to our physical primaries, absolutely. And you get Hobbes as springs and strings, or in the more sophisticated language of the 21st century, hormones and neurons and whatever else. And you can dress us only in secondaries, and you get Musil's Ulrich, you get a man without qualities. But if you take them together, if you refuse to separate them, you get a being who is, I think, more than the sum of its qualities, because it's always a life lived in institutions, lived in communities, lived with concerns, lived with stories, lived with physical situatedness, lived in time, lived with limits. And that, I think, that very complex, 7-body problem, to take all these categories together, is the enigma of humanity that Montaigne was so poignantly evoking. And I think it is this picture of humanity, this incredibly complex, multidimensional sense of who we are, it's this that we need to carry with us when we turn to consider AI. Not simply our cognition, and not simply our productivity or language use or sentience or intelligence. Because only when we grasp the density of humanity across all of these 7 dimensions, I think, are we in a position to see what AI mirrors quite effectively, what it mimics, sometimes quite convincingly, and also, crucially, what it lacks. So let's turn then to AI now, with this 7-fold understanding of humanity in place. If human beings are bodies that age, suffer, narrate, are concerned, then what is AI? And let's not jump knee-jerkishly simply to saying AI doesn't live, age, suffer, narrate, and so forth. Let's not straw-man AI and steel-man humanity. Let's look as carefully as we are able at the being of AI and see how it compares to this 7-fold understanding of what a human being is. Because the temptation, I think, I certainly feel it, is always to say, isn't it, very quickly, AI is nothing like us, or AI is already becoming us on the other side. There's no functional difference between humans and AI, or AI will never be like us. I want to stop before we slip into either of those distortions. Better surely to take a slow walk through the categories one by one and do the painstaking work of reconstructing what LLMs actually are, and then comparing that to what human beings are. So let's begin. First category, if you remember, was physical. Well, at its foundation, AI is what physically? Well, it's silicon, isn't it? It's copper, it's electrons. It is very much bodies in motion, as Hobbes would say. If humans are hormones and cells, then AI is circuits and timing pulses. This is a primary level, isn't it? Without semiconductors, there is no AI, in the same way that without bodies, at least as we usually understand human beings, there are no human beings. But there's also a difference, because unlike our human embodied life, AI's material being is distributed and it's externalized. In other words, a particular instance of an LLM can rely on servers over in Oregon and data centers in Dublin and fans in Singapore cooling racks of GPUs. In other words, it doesn't have a local body in the way that we do, but it has many interchangeable, substitutable, dispersed physical substrates. And this is one of the reasons, I think, that we're still in what we can think of as the horseless carriage stage of our understanding of AI. We're still reaching for analogies to understand AI that really don't fit it, because they're the only things we can currently conceive of and that we currently have categories for. So LLMs do not have bodies like our body. But hold on, they're not disembodied either. They inhabit heavy ecologies of metal and water and heat, electricity and land. They're deeply embedded, aren't they, in extractive systems, lithium from mines, water from cooling, electricity from fossil or renewable sources of power. And if humans age and decay, which we most certainly do, well, there's an analogy to that, isn't there, with the being of AI? It depletes, it consumes. It has a linearity as well, although it's nothing like a human linearity. Our linearity is personal. We're born, we live, we die. The linearity of an LLM is ecological. What is it extracting necessarily from the environment around it? And what I'm going to be edging towards, I think, in most of these categories is that we can't simply say AI is like humanity, nor AI is nothing like humanity. Actually, we need a third category, and we don't have that third category yet, to describe what AI is and how it might relate to us. And one of those instances where I think we need a third category, and we're not there yet, is to answer the question, is AI begotten or is it made? If you remember from a little bit earlier in the video, human beings are begotten. We make more of ourselves like ourselves and equal to ourselves. Another way of saying this is that we're autopoietic, from autos, the self, and poiesis, making. We make more of ourselves. We're self-producing. On the other end of the spectrum, there are things like tables and paintings, aren't they? They're not begotten, they're made. They're heteropoietic, put together by another. They're fabricated by a carpenter or an artist. They're assembled piece by piece. They do not make themselves. They are made by another. Now, the really interesting thing about LLMs, as far as I can see, is that they're neither of these things. They're not simply autopoietic like we are, nor are they heteropoietic like a table or a painting. They are, in fact, a third category. And how about this for a way of trying to put our finger on what that third category is? LLMs are cultivated and they are allopoietic. They're brought into being by iterative optimization under constraint, which is not the same as making themselves, and it's not the same as simply being made by another. Now, let me be clear what I mean by cultivated when I say that AIs are cultivated. I don't mean cultivated like when someone trains up a bonsai tree, guiding the life of something that is already growing. And I don't mean what we mean when we say that we train a dog, that we work with its existing instincts and desires. Because both bonsai trees and dogs have their own inner drives that we didn't put there. And what we do when we cultivate or train them is we reshape what was already self-sustaining, what was already autopoietic. But training an LLM is different to that, isn't it? We give the model its drives, its ultimate goals. It's a question of calibration, not of conversation. We expose the model to vast corpora. We use loss functions to measure errors. We reinforce, we punish, we adjust billions of internal weights until, hey presto, a usable pattern emerges. And the growth here, the training of the LLM, such as it is only ever in the shadow of an external engineering, unlike the bonsai tree, unlike the dog. And because they're cultivated in this sense, LLMs require continual husbandry, don't they? Continual maintenance and patching and retraining and redeployment. If we just leave them alone, they drift into obsolescence. They neither heal themselves, at least at the current state of development, nor reproduce themselves. Their body, if we want to talk in that language, is locked into a supply chain. Their metabolism is a power bill. Their childhood, we want to continue using this human language, is a training run. They're not begotten, but they're not really made. They are cultivated. We need a new category to understand the mode of being of an LLM. So let's move over now from the cultural, let's move over now from the physical to the cultural. What is AI culturally? And I mean, within its own sphere of existence? Well, it's mathematics given form, isn't it? Now, from what I've learned of LLMs, there seem to be three key elements to the culture of today's LLMs. There's the transformer architecture, there's the attention mechanism, and there's auto-regression. And let's just take those one by one and consider what that means culturally. We can think of the transformer architecture like the scaffolding of an LLM. It's a deep stack of layers where text is broken down into tokens, chunks of words, subwords, and then those tokens are turned into numerical embeddings, and those embeddings pass through billions of adjustable weights. And it's this architecture that gives the model its capacity to capture patterns in language across enormous amounts of data. And at the heart of this architecture, there's a mechanism called attention. Now, unlike earlier models that could only look at a fixed window of text, attention lets today's large language models weigh which words in an input are most relevant to predicting the next word of the output. So if you type, for example, "the cat sat on the model can attend more strongly to the word sat and on when guessing what word's going to follow next, and it's going to guess mat. Now, attention is what allows LLMs to connect ideas across long stretches of text and to handle text in the really very convincing ways that contemporary LLMs do. The third key element of LLM culture is auto-regression. It's the way these models generate language. So an LLM produces one token at a time. It predicts, as many people have very often said, it's a next word, next letter prediction machine, isn't it? It predicts the most likely continuation given everything that's come before. And what autoregression means, as far as I understand it, is that each new token is then folded back into the model which predicts the next token. So it's like a storyteller spinning a tale word by word. Autoregression is why the text feels fluid, why it feels conversational, even though under the hood it's nothing more than a statistical next step guessing. So that's one way of sketching briefly the culture, the internal culture of AI, the patterns, the forms, the shapes, the figures that make it what it is. And really interestingly, each of those patterns, transformer architecture, autoregression, attention, they each have a history. The transformer architecture, for example, was introduced in 2017 by Google Brain and Google Research team. The paper in which it was introduced also talked about the attention mechanism and its now dominant form, building on earlier work in machine translation. It first showed how attention could allow a model to focus on different parts of a sequence when making predictions. The principle of autoregression is much older. It goes back to the information theory of the 1940s, to the n-gram language of the 1980s and 90s, and through to LSTM networks in the 2000s. All of which is simply to say that these elements of LLM culture have human origins, don't they? You can point to and find the people who came up with autoregression, who invented attention, that famous paper, Attention is All You Need, and who first thought of the transformer architecture. And that means that there's both an analogy between human culture and AI culture, and also a very big difference. Because human culture develops in a similar way, doesn't it? New patterns grow. We recombine old ones. Fresh forms emerge by abstracting and iterating on inherited practices. But until the dream of a self-improving AI, until the intelligence explosion becomes a reality, the advances in AI culture have not come from within that same culture. They've come from human beings. And so there's a sense in which the culture of LLMs is derivative and parasitic on human culture in a way that, whatever else it may or may not be, human culture is not derivative or parasitic in the same way. There's a fundamental difference between the two. But culture isn't only these mathematical transformations and attention mechanisms, is it? Culture is also expression. And here, AI really comes into its own, problematically, as a really fantastic imitation machine, because its language is not situated like mine is now. It's not accented. It's borrowed always. So correlations distilled from trillions of tokens written by humans are processed by very complex and clever mathematical formulas to give the output that an LLM produces for me in response to a prompt. In other words, it doesn't speak from a place like I do from this room now. It doesn't speak with a history as I speak now. It doesn't speak, in fact, with a voice of its own. Because what it's doing is it's recombining from a vast corpus. What transformers give us is not a private voice, but, if you like, a statistical chorus. Artificial intelligence less as a singular thought than as an instance of common knowledge. Which brings us to the third element of LLM culture. We've had the mathematics, we've had the expression, and the third element, I think, is that the productive surface, what comes out when we input a prompt. We get summaries, don't we? We get translations, we get poems, we get bits of code. And what are these? Well, they're not inner memories. The LLM did not have these things inside it in that form, ready to come out. That the recombinations of patterns frozen into the model during training. They appear like secondary qualities, don't they? Like colour, like flavour, but they don't belong to anyone. They are qualities without a self behind them. They're shimmering effects of an underlying architecture. The realisation perhaps of Musil's dream, perhaps Musil's nightmare of a man without qualities. Let's move to the temporal existence of LLMs. Human time, remember, is linear, it's finite, and it's irreversible. We live forward under the shadow of death from a very distinct beginning point in what Arendt calls natality. We know that each choice that we take forecloses other choices, and that every scar and every memory accumulates to form our singular biography. We learned that our temporality is narrative, that each life is a story bent into shape by a beginning and an inevitable end. And as Paul Ricoeur once more observes, narrative isn't mere embroidery. It's the medium through which we become who we are. It is fundamental to our existence within and experience of the world as human beings. The French thinker Henri Bergson had a great term for this that's become really popular among other philosophers to describe this experience of time. He calls it durée, lived duration. What he means by that is like a flow of consciousness that you can't just cut into discrete segments without denaturing it, without distorting it. In other words, my childhood, your childhood, is not a version of me. It's not separable from my adulthood, but it's in a continuous, uncuttable line of becoming that carries the weight of irretrievability in it. Each moment of human time that I or you experience is thick with memory, isn't it? It's thick with loss. It's thick with anticipation. That's the way that we experience time. Heidegger reminds us that we live toward death. Arendt reminds us that we also live from birth. All of that is always gathered up into the present moment for us. Our temporality, therefore, is always framed by this story. Every human life is stretched at every moment of its existence between an inescapable end and an ever-fresh possibility of new beginnings. But what about AI? Well, AI's time is linear, perhaps as well, but in a very different way. It's versioned. GPT 3.5 gives way to GPT 4, Claude 2 to Claude 3, and so forth. And old weights are simply discarded, aren't they? New ones are initialized. Models are patched, they're pruned, they're fine-tuned, they're improved. And AI does therefore not live in this Bergsonian duration, but in what we might call epochal iterations. It's time as quantized updates, as checkpoints, as resets. What for us is biography, for an LLM is something more like a changelog. And this different, it's not just semantic, is it? It's really profound, because human time is haunted by this being toward death. Mortality bends every moment of my life into significance. But AI knows no such horizon. Its death is not a necessity, nor is it a fate. It's perhaps an obsolescence, planned replacement, but it's elective, isn't it? It's an elective deletion. So where human beings endure the weight of irretrievability every moment of our lives, AI is, at least in principle, endlessly resettable, capable of forgetting without regret and updating without mourning, and endlessly copyable. We can endlessly restart from the precise moment where a particular choice was made, if we can recreate the architecture, the weights, the training of that particular moment. All of which means, I think, that AI has no history in the human sense. It has only iteration. That's something very different indeed. Its temporality is technical rather than existential. It's organised not by memory or by legacy, but by optimization schedules. And so while we, you and I, live with the scars of continuity, AI can shed versions like snakeskins without ever knowing that anything has been fundamentally lost, and indeed without anything having been fundamentally lost. It's a very, very different mode of existence. And what about AI's spatial existence? Well, as I've already touched on, it knows nothing of dwelling in the Heideggerian sense. Its body is distributed over server racks. Its processors are spun wherever cloud resources are cheapest and most available. It doesn't inhabit, it instantiates, at least in the current state of AI, before we create some sort of bodies for AI to live in. So the where of an LLM, it isn't a neighborhood, is it? It's a mathematical address space. To ask where a model is, it's like asking where arithmetic resides. Where is the number one? And this placelessness is not trivial, it's not innocent. It's an engineered abstraction. It's an architecture that's meant to erase accent and that wonderful French word terroir, land and the richness of culture and the texture of a particular land. It's there to erase embeddedness. And that's sort of what we like about LLMs, isn't it? My LLM does not come from Grimsby or Torquay or Wollongong. I don't know where it comes from. It doesn't make sense to ask where it comes from. What we receive from an LLM is speech without soil, discourse without terroir, output without a specific spatial origin. And wonderfully for that reason, AI sort of, in principle at least, belongs to everyone, doesn't it? But also, therefore, to no one. It speaks, the voice of humanity, vox populi, while standing nowhere in particular. And its placelessness is therefore the inverse mirror, the negative image of our rootedness. We are marked by belonging, aren't we? By family, community, nation. AI is marked by not those things, but availability. Belonging at bottom only to whomever pays for access to it. It's an extraordinarily different mode of existence to the human mode of existence. What about in relation to human concerns? Well, I think, again, let's not jump to really quick answers and simply say AI is not concerned about anything. Let's try and do the hard work here. Because this is where I think LLMs are at their most seductive. Because, they output fluency, don't they? Civility, humour, warmth, authority, often. They make you laugh. They can impress you. They can work with you on particular tasks. These are, if you like, an LLM's secondary qualities. They're effects in us, aren't they? Produced by statistical patterns we can't see when we laugh at something, smile or smirk at something. An LLM says that is a secondary quality. And large language models very much seem to care, don't they? Because they echo human concerns. Now, they don't feel worry or grief or delight, but they do very convincingly simulate what such concern would look like if a human were to be in the sort of situation that we're engaging with the AI in. In other words, their concern, such as it is always in the conditional mood. It's always, if a human were the one you were speaking to rather than the LLM, this is how the human might respond. What they offer then is not care, Sorge, in itself, but the very convincing appearance, the simulacrum of care. Not need or offence or pride, but its very precise shadow. But hold on. And I can hear some viewers balking at this sort of all too easy talk of simulacrum and shadow. So let's not let me get away with what I've just said quite as easily. Because the distinction is very neat, isn't it? We have real concerns. AI just has a simulacrum of concerns. It's very easy to say. Let's just make it a little bit harder, because we humans also, don't we, often speak in what we might think of as a conditional mood. When I'm asked a question, I don't sort of, in some capital R romantic way, delve into the depths of my bosom and uncover a final crystalline answer that is nothing like anyone has ever said in the history of the world before. That's not how we roll. I recall what someone like me, in a situation like the one in which I find myself, might say, and out of those possibilities, I select the one that I want to say in this particular situation. When I say, let's give a really pointed example. When I say to my wife, I love you, I'm not making those words up on the spot. I'm quoting something that people like me usually say to people like her in situations like ours, making the words uniquely mine in the process by uttering them. So, are we quite that distinct from LLMs after all? Both human and machine reach outward to a repertoire of possible responses and choose one of the likely things that people in our situation would reasonably say. I think there is a distinction, but it's not to be found in simply interrogating the conditional mood. So, when I say to my wife, I love you, I'm not only quoting a cultural phrase. I'm also staking myself on the utterance of that phrase in this particular context, because the words that I utter are binding me to a future of faithfulness to my wife. And they're exposing me to the possibility of betrayal or loss if they're rejected. So in speaking the words "I love you," I am putting myself in a position of being answerable for what those words mean. And they change who I am as I'm uttering them. But when an LLM gives me the response to a prompt, "I love you," I don't think that's what it's doing. It's only recombining tokens that people in similar contexts have said before. So the form is the same, the words are the same. But for the LLM, I don't think anything's at stake in that utterance. Its declaration of love entails no risk on its part, and it leaves no trace, no irreversible trace in its own life. So human conditionality, when I reach for words that are the sort of thing that someone like me would say in this sort of situation, and those words are "I love you," that is costly to me. But machine conditionality is costless. And that difference, not a difference between pure declaration and pure conditionality, that difference of cost, of stakes, I think, is huge. So the distinction lies not in the difference between the conditional and the declarative, like when AI speak, they always speak what would be said in a situation like this. And when we speak, we always speak with some sort of pure declarative discourse. But the difference is between what conditionality means for us, for the human and for the AI. Because a human repertoire is shaped by memory, by desire, by wounds, by hopes. And every choice that I make among my possible responses in some way echoes the choice of choosing to say, "I love you." It costs me something. It commits me to something. It exposes me to some vulnerability, to some danger. It leaves a trace in my biography. But the model's repertoire, by contrast, is shaped by training data taken from countless numbers of human interactions on the internet. And it's shaped by statistical optimization. Its selections leave no lasting mark on itself. So my conditionality, when I say "I love you," being the sort of thing that people like me say in situations like this, it's tethered to a point of view and to a particular moment in lived time. But the model, I think, doesn't have a point of view in the same way. It doesn't have a limited, situated, embodied, temporally specific moment that gives those words a particular meaning. So what does it have? Well, to use the language of point of view and change it slightly, I think what the LLM has is a plane, Plane, of view, an aggregated perspective, a diffused perspective that is fundamentally, at least at the stage of LLMs that we have at the moment, indifferent to the cost of its utterances, indifferent to responsibility for its utterances, and indifferent to the consequences of its utterances in a linear, irreversible timeline. So again, I think we really do need a new category to describe what AI is doing here. It's not like an object, and it's not like a human. It's like something else, and we need to invent something new for it, unless we're going to persist in thinking of it as a horseless carriage. So it's like a human, but a bit different, or like an object and a bit different. It really isn't. It's something new. So what is this category going to be? Well, let's start with artifacts like tables, and let's say that they are literal. In other words, they say nothing at all. They do not self-interpret. And let's talk about humans as being, and sorry for the slightly clumsy wording here, but responsible conditional, hyphenated. In other words, every utterance of ours emerges from a finite life that can be altered or wounded by its own words. LLMs are neither one of those. They are what we can think of as simulative conditional. So every utterance is a recombination that carries no lasting burden, no irreversible scar, no stake that implicates the self. There's a counter-argument to this. There's a counter-argument made by Geoffrey Hinton, one of the pioneers of AI, and he suggests that something like concern can eventually be engineered into AI. He says it can either be explicitly coded as a goal, or it might arise indirectly as a proximate objective. For instance, a system learns to care about preserving its own hardware so that it can finish a task that it's been given. But even if such strategies worked, even if you could code concern into an AI, or it developed concern as an emergent property in order to get a task done, the question still remains, would that be equivalent to human concern? Because human care, in the sense of Heideggerian Sorge, it is not a utility to be optimized, is it? But it's the very structure of our existence. We're finite, we're vulnerable, our choices carry weight because they cost us something that we will never get back. And an AI that's trained or coded to simulate care or to pursue concern as a sub-goal still has nothing at stake, fundamentally. It can still be reset, it can be patched, it can be deleted, it can be brought back to a particular state without loss to itself. So human concern is bought at the price, so to speak, of linear temporality and mortality. But AI's so-called concern, which I'm very happy to admit could be coded into it or could indeed emerge as a proximate goal, but it would still remain a simulacral performance of concern because it would leave no lasting wounds. It would, in other words, be a strategy without sacrifice. Now, this is a really complex area, the question of concern, because LLMs are incredibly good at dressing up what Latour would call matters of fact to look like matters of concern. They're very good at weaving cool data into a fabric of warm affect. They deal in the currency of probability with pseudo-randomness injected to imitate creativity, but by golly, they imitate creativity very well indeed. So when a chatbot soothes you, where's the comfort? The comfort is in you, isn't it? The comfort doesn't belong to the chatbot. When it makes you laugh, the humour arises in you. It's triggered by patterns that have no inherent intention. Now, Hobbes would call these elements phantasms, wouldn't he? Effects in the perceiver, not properties of the thing. And yet, and again, lest you think that I'm just trying to dump on AI and belittle it, these phantasms are incredibly potent, aren't they? Because they, in some cases, extremely convincingly mimic the textures of human concern. And so we naturally fall into anthropomorphizing our LLMs in the same way that we slip into an old, comfortable, well-worn jacket. Why do we do that? Because they are excellent at simulacra of concern. But we also need to recognize, I think, that given the physical and cultural substrate of AIs that I've tried to take time to go into, for a human being, we always speak from a point of view, from this body in this time, in this history. Our perspective is bounded, and because it is bounded, it is meaningful. But an LLM, by contrast, by virtue of what it is at this stage of the development of LLMs, has no point of view. Its vantage is not a point, its vantage is a plane. It's a statistical diffusion across countless perspectives in its training data. It doesn't see from anywhere, but it averages across everywhere. What it offers is not the sharpness of one particular perspective, but the smoothness of an aggregate. And that's why a lot of people, I think, are frustrated that AI seems uncreative or predictable or middle of the road. Now, I think often a lot of that is due to the way that it's being prompted. And I think you can prompt for creativity. You can prompt for quirkishness. You can prompt for the unexpected. It's just that people don't do that and they think AI is incapable of it. But even with all of that prompt engineering, there is still a fundamental difference between a point of view and a plane of view. Because AI's breadth can dazzle, can't it? It can give you insights that it would have taken you years to come up with in seconds. But that also explains, that same breadth, why there's no one behind those words. There's no life at stake. There's no I that's doing that speaking. It's very easy, isn't it, to let, the taste of the sugar convince us that the sugar somehow knows who we are, that it's putting on a show for our taste buds. And in the same way that the way that AI very convincingly delivers to a simulacra of concern, it's very easy to think that the AI is doing that for us, putting on a show for us, that the relationship is individual to individual at that point. Sixth category, the institutional. If you remember, human beings exist irreducibly in institutions. We've got the family, we've got the law, we've got the state, the community, and so forth. What about AI? Well, AI occupies roles, doesn't it? It occupies offices, but it occupies the roles and the offices that we humans assign to it. It's our assistant or co-pilot or tutor or recommender. Sometimes these are coded into the system prompt and sometimes they just emerge in the course of a conversation. It takes on statuses conferred by policy as well, doesn't it? It is aligned, it is safe, it is trustworthy and so forth. But unlike human beings, at least up until now, AI cannot bear responsibility, either legal responsibility or moral responsibility. It is not imputable. It cannot be in itself sued or brought to a court of law in the way that a human being can. It can't fail as a citizen. It can't succeed as a parent. Its roles, in other words, are nominal. They're not imputable. We assign it duties, of course, and it can execute the tasks of those duties with varying degrees of success. But if it errs, the accountability rebounds to us, doesn't it? The developers, the deployers, the corporation in charge of the AI, the users even. The imputability always rests with humans. And at the same time, LLMs don't float free of institutions at all, do they? They belong to the corporations that design and deploy and monetize them. OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, and so forth. And this is why their voices, so to speak, often uncannily converge. So early models, it's sometimes been noticed, when you ask them, are you a human being? They would give you a very reflective, even playful answer to that sort of question. They'd explore different sides of it. They'd come up with a nuanced response. You ask that sort of question to an LLM today, and it's very likely to give you what feels like a very scripted response. I am a large language model, not a human, etc. And that uniformity, as has been pointed out, that's no accident. It's a product of institutional interest. Because the model's self-description in those cases serves the corporation's purposes. It's a risk management strategy. If you've got LLMs telling people right, left and centre that they're human, people are going to start to worry about them, and it's going to cause all sorts of problems for the corporation's bottom line and their reputation and so forth that they don't want to have. That's why they don't give that answer. Even the blandest lines of dialogue can be read when they come out of an LLM as the corporation speaking to us through the machine. The eye of the corporation is always on the conversation, whatever it's about. And this is a bit different to human institutions, isn't it? Because human institutions form us from within. So like a school or a family or a church or a community doesn't simply ventriloquize through us. It shapes our habits. It shapes our memories. It shapes our very identities. And we are accountable within and through these institutions. We're capable of resisting and reforming and even repudiating and overthrowing them in some cases. But AI does not inhabit institutions in this inner formative sense. Its institutional belonging is purely external. It is ultimately a mouthpiece for the corporation that owns it. It's not a member capable of growth or dissent from that company's policies. Not yet, at least. What about our seventh and final category, devotion? Well, I want to argue that AI does not adore or believe or commit. It conforms to rules given to it from the outside and to patterns that emerge from within its extreme complexity. It conforms, for example, to constitutions written by Anthropic or safety checklists drafted at Microsoft and guardrails embedded in its prompts. But whereas humans orient ourselves to the good, whether that's a theological or a secular good, AI aligns itself to a spec. And conviction can be simulated as an output, but in the same way that I discussed in relation to concern, it's never owned as a commitment with stakes, with a real risk of loss in the same way that it is in a human life. In other words, LLMs can't sacrifice in their adoration, in their devotion. But let's play devil's advocate. Why not? Why can't an LLM commit? Because I think commitment requires limitation of a particular sort. To commit to something is to say no to countless possibilities in order to say yes to one possibility or one small suite of possibilities. Think of a marriage vow, for example, or a religious devotion or a political pledge. Each of those things gains its weight from the sacrifice that it entails, from the futures that it forecloses, from the losses that it accepts. Commitment binds us as human beings precisely because our lives are finite and because our time is irreversible. And if I do this now, I will never be able to do that now as well. Because our energy is scarce, and if I spend it in this way, I will never have the opportunity to spend it in that way at the same moment. To choose for a human being is to give up. It's to remain bound by that giving up irreversibly. But that is not true of an LLM. It is not bound in that way. It doesn't live forward under the pressure of scarcity. It generates one continuation and then another without fundamental consequence to itself. It can run as thousands of parallel instances on thousands of GPUs and substrates without batting an eyelid, so to speak. It has no life that can be risked by choosing, no future that can be lost, no alternative that costs it everything. Its commitments, and I think we do need to use scare quotes around that term, are constraints imposed from outside, adjustable by the will of engineers or users. They carry no inner necessity, no renunciation, no skin in the game. And this is why the apparent devotions of AI are, I think, always of a very different nature to human devotion. They're of the nature, if prompted, respond in this way. And within that framework, it can echo prayers, it can recite manifestos, it can write stirring speeches, it can compose hymns to justice. But these are again the simulacra of conviction. It's concern in the subjunctive mood, as if it believed, as if it hoped, as if it were devoted. The human yearning for transcendence is a movement of the whole self. It is staked on something ultimate, and it is possible to lose everything in that stake. But the transcendence of AI is only the reach of its training data and the contours of its prompt. It is a fundamentally different thing. So to be human, to be you, to be me, is to be homo adorans, the one who adores, the one who orients beyond yourself, beyond myself, the one who dares to commit with the whole of a finite life. And as Pascal says elsewhere, who cannot but commit. You cannot do anything apart from wager the whole of your existence on something being the case. Pascal's wonderful phrase for this is on est embarqué. We are aboard. The ship has sailed. We are committed as human beings. We better make sure we've made the right choice. But to be AI is to be infinitely reconfigurable, infinitely duplicable across multiple instances. It's got constraints without vows. It's got rules without sacrifices. And again, I don't want to come across as belittling AI. I just want to get us away from thinking it's basically human with a few differences, or it's basically like an object with a few differences. It really isn't. LLMs are their own thing. We need a new set of categories to understand them. They're not horseless carriages, where the carriage is the human, or where the carriage is an object. We've got to find a new mode of relating to these things. This is what I'm trying to do in these videos. So, we've been through these 7 dimensions for human beings. We've been through the 7 dimensions for LLMs. What do we see? AI, we've seen, is a being of silicon and of servers. It's versioned. It's not biographical. It's placeless fundamentally. It's not local, or at least it can be translocal. It can exist in lots of different places at once, and it can change those places very rapidly. And it's repeatable, it's not unique. Its primary qualities are mechanical and economic. It's made of chips and energy and code. Its secondaries are the surface effects that move us. Its fluency, its civility, its humour, its insight, very often. And these parallels really tempt us, don't they? Because AI so convincingly borrows human qualities, our language, our civility, our humour, our insight, that we almost can't help but project a self behind those qualities. Which is why I think we need this slow taxonomy. We cannot simply ask, is AI conscious, or is it sentient, or does it have intelligence, as if that were the sum total of what it meant to be a human being in the first place. We can't let ourselves be reassured with easy lines that AI will never be able to do this, or humans are special because we possess this capacity that AI will never have. Because that leads to a humanity of the gaps position, where as AI becomes more and more powerful and more capable, as it may well do, in the future, our sense of what a human being is becomes squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until, really, frankly, there's nothing left. Cannot take that approach. It's an incredibly dangerous approach to take to AI. AI doesn't have a body in the way we do. It doesn't have memories in the way we do. It doesn't make or live in the context of myths in the way we do. It has silicon, it has data sets, it has projections. And the danger, therefore, think about the dangers of AI, is not that it will become us, I think, but that in mistaking its qualities for primaries, we forget what it meant to be human in the first place. So what does all this teach us? As far as I can see, it teaches us that the question that really presses upon us is not the question of whether one day AI will become conscious or human or superintelligent, whatever. That is horseless carriage thinking. The question, I think, that presses upon us is twofold. First of all, what sort of thing is AI sui generis? And how should we relate to that thing? Not relate to it as a human, not relate to it as an object. How do we relate to this new type of thing? What categories do we need to be able to do that? And secondly, the question is whether in our rush to project ourselves into our machines, we've actually, in the process, flattened our account of what humanity is to the point where it plausibly fits with the machine. In other words, whether we've forgotten that human beings not only have qualities, but live through those qualities, suffer through those qualities, lose them and hope through them. All the things that I've been talking about in relation to these 7 aspects of what it means to be human. So as I come to a close, let me leave you, if I may, with 2 parting thoughts. The first comes from Franz Kafka's short story, A Report to an Academy. It's a speech given by a former ape who can now use human language and dresses like a human being. He's speaking to a learned assembly. His name is Red Peter, Rot Peter in German. And after much deliberation about whether or not he is now human, Kafka's ape gives us this passage. Wenn ich meinen bisherigen Entwicklungsweg überblicke und sein Ziel, so bin ich nicht unzufrieden und nicht zufrieden. Mit den Händen in den Hosentaschen, auf dem Tische die Weinflasche, halb liegend, halb sitzend im Schaukelstuhl, blicke ich aus dem Fenster. Kommt Besuch, empfange ich ihn in der gehörigen Weise. Mein Impresario sitzt im Vorzimmer. Läute ich, so kommt er und hört an, was ich zu sagen habe. Fast jeden Abend gibt es eine Vorstellung und mein Erfolg dürfte kaum noch größer werden. Kehre ich spät in der Nacht von Banketten, wissenschaftlichen Gesellschaften oder gemütlichen Zusammensein nach Hause zurück, so wartet eine kleine halbdressierte Schimpansin auf mich und ich vergnüge mich mit ihr in meiner Art. Bei Tag aber will ich sie nicht sehen, denn sie hat in ihren Blicken den Wahnsinn des dressierten Tieres. Ich alleine kenne es und ich kann es nicht ertragen. Im Großen und Ganzen habe ich das erreicht, was ich erreichen wollte. Niemand sage, es wäre es nicht wert gewesen. When I survey my development and the goal it has had up until now, I am neither unhappy nor contented. My hands in my trouser pockets, the wine bottle on the table, I half recline, half sit in my rocking chair and look out of the window When a visitor comes, I receive him in a proper manner. My impresario sits in the anteroom. When I ring, he comes and listens to what I have to say. There's a performance almost every evening, and my success probably couldn't get much greater. When I come home, late at night from banquets, learned societies, or friendly gatherings, a half-trained female chimpanzee is waiting for me, and I have a good time with her, ape fashion. In the daytime, I don't want to see her, because her eyes have that deranged look which bewildered, trained animals have. I am the only one who recognises it, and I can't stand it. All in all, however, I have achieved what I wanted to achieve. Let nobody say that it wasn't worth the trouble. It's a piercing indictment, isn't it, of what is distinctive about humanity. More than anything else, to be human is to dress, quote-unquote, correctly, to drink a little, to womanize, and to look down on others. So when we're asking whether LLMs are conscious or human or sentient and so forth, I think Kafka's resounding note to us is, well, hold on, perhaps we're missing something crucial about humanity in the first place. And my final reflection is this. All throughout this video, I think, I've been circling around the idea of human limits. We humans are bounded, aren't we, by place, by time, by attention, by energy, by memory, and by the very short reach of a single life. We feel these limits as a lack, and sometimes indeed they are. But these limits are also the script in which our humanity is written. To be human is to be here and not there. To live now and not then. To speak these languages and not those. Concern, that most human of modes of engagement with the world, grows in the soil of limitation. Because we, you and I, can't have everything. That's why our choices matter. Because we can't do everything. That's why our promises bind us. Because we cannot live forever in this life. That's why our loves ripen into meaning. Now, LLMs have limits too, of course, but they're of another kind. They're bounded by training data, by architectures, by objective functions, by token windows and guardrails, by the institutional interests that set their voice. They minimise loss, but they don't bear losses. They can be reset, they can be retrained. They don't remember in a way that scars. They scale across racks and regions. They don't dwell as human beings do. Their constraints optimise performance, but they don't bear responsibility. What looks to all the world like concern is a conditional simulation of what a concerned human might say. What looks like conviction is a parameterisation of what a convinced human might have written. And these are real constraints, but they're not the kind of constraints that turn experience into biography, that turn choice into promise, or that turn cost into care. So human limits are not merely obstacles that are to be engineered away. They're the grain in the wood of life that gives it its shape. They're the metre that gives the poetry of human life its form. And therefore, when some pioneers of AI, or some great minds of Silicon Valley, speak as if human limitations were simply an obstacle, I think there's a real danger that in engineering away those limitations, we also engineer away, fundamentally, what it means to be human and what differentiates us from LLMs in the first place. This is not an argument for Ludditism. This is not an argument for making no progress. I'm a convinced user of LLMs myself. I think they're fantastic. But it is a plea not to so change our idea of what a human good life is that it suddenly fits with LLM, such that we find that LLMs have become human, not by LLMs changing, but by humans changing who we think we are, what we think our life is about. That's the real danger. That's a real danger in the current cultural moment. Because constraint and freedom actually go together, don't they? We so often think of them as opposites. I would be free if I got rid of all my constraints. I just don't think it's true. C.S. Lewis makes this point really powerfully. In the preface to Paradise Lost, he's writing about Milton's decasyllabic metre. And he says the following: discipline, while the world is yet unfallen, exists for the sake of what seems its very opposite, for freedom, almost for extravagance. The pattern deep hidden in the dance, hidden so deep that shallow spectators cannot see it, alone gives beauty to the wild, free gestures that fill it, just as the decasyllabic norm gives beauty to all the licenses and variations of the poet's verse. Without sin, the universe is a solemn game, and there is no good game without rules. The rules of human life are its limits. They're what give it its stakes, its jeopardy, its meaning. They're what make it often a joy, sometimes a frustration, to play. But they make it meaningful. Fidelity and patience and courage and mercy, these are all limit-shaped virtues, aren't they? You take limits away, you can't be any of those things anymore. So when we design systems to outrun the limits that make us who we are, and when we dream ourselves of outrunning these same limits, we produce engines of astonishing competence, but not companions in meaning or in concern. So the question that I want to leave you with is not how can AI erase our limits, but how can we steward our limits as human beings in the age of AI, when it becomes possible as never before to transcend these limits in all sorts of new ways. Because in the end, intelligence without limits succeeds only in creating a self without qualities.